The following is a broadcast of the Emergency Podcast System. Had this been a real podcast, you would leave edified and entertained.
Hey folks, welcome to the Emergency Podcast System. I'm your host, Pete Cantillon. You know, I was planning on doing a different subject this week, but obviously what's timely right now is the subject of guns. So let's talk about guns for a bit. For those of you who aren't aware, I've been living under a rock. There was another mass shooting in the United States recently. 21 people killed, 19 grade 4 students in Texas, Uvalde, Texas. And as with every other mass shooting, this has galvanized the gun rights lobby, and it has galvanized the gun control lobby. You have the same arguments and the same actions teeter-tottering back and forth that have been occurring year over year for as long as this has been an issue, which goes back farther than I can remember. Now, guns and the United States, this is a difficult subject. And some people would say it's simple. You know, I don't think it's as simple as we'd like it to be. For the record, I've used all kinds of guns in my life. I currently do not own any guns. I've never been a gun owner, but as a member of the 11th Field Regiment Artillery in Guelph, I was a weapons technician. Let's see, what have I used? So I've used a 9mm submachine gun, a Browning high-powered 9mm pistol. I've fired a .357 Magnum, a .45. I have fired a .30 caliber machine gun and an FN high-powered rifle with the same caliber bullets. I have had the opportunity to toss grenades on the grenade range and obviously worked alongside my peers on the range and firing howitzers, 105mm howitzer artillery. So I've seen guns, I've seen what they can do, and I have been trained in the correct usage of guns and various weapons, how to handle ammunition, what to do and what not to do, and most importantly, understanding the best way to safely manage them, especially around other people. So I believe, given the experience that I've had, that you know, if you're going to own a gun, you need to have a significant amount of training. In Canada, where I live, you have to have you have to pass a test, both a written and practical test, and be licensed to own rifles and shotguns. If you want to own anything other than that, like certain types of handguns and certain other types of rifles, then you need to get a restricted firearms license. And there is a whole slew of weapons that are not even allowed to be owned in Canada. So we don't have the same level of gun violence that you see in the United States. Of course, our population is 10 times smaller, but on a per capita basis, gun violence is not even close to what is happening in the United States. But gun ownership in Canada is actually pretty high. It's not as low as you would think. I'll try to dig those statistics up while we're talking. But when we look at the United States, we're looking at something staggeringly different. There are nearly 400 million guns estimated to be owned in the United States by private citizens. That source is from Small Arms Survey, World Meter. There are 330 million people living in the United States, but 400 million guns, and 76 million registered gun owners. So you just toss that about in your head for a little bit. And of course, you can own all kinds of weapons in the United States. From state to state, there are various restrictions, but generally speaking, gun ownership is fairly simple. It's not a difficult process. If you live in a state where there's a lot of where there are background checks or a waiting period, you can just drive to the next state over, pick up your gun, and bring it home. It's not. It's difficult to restrict and regulate and manage gun ownership in the United States on a state-by-state basis. But at the federal level, when they try to regulate these things, it gets stopped in the Senate, and typically by Republicans, who receive a great deal of funding from the National Rifle Association, whose goal is to protect the rights of the American citizen as it relates to the Second Amendment of the Constitution, which guarantees the right to bear arms for the purposes of having a well-regulated militia, should one be required in case the government becomes oppressive. And this comes from their experience in coming out of the American Revolution, their experience with Britain. It's forged out of a great and deep sense of distrust of centralized, that there need to be access to weapons to the private citizen for the sake of protection of property, protection of self, protection of loved ones, and again, protection against a tyrannical state should one ever rise up and become a problem. And, there's all kinds of issues with what is a tyrannical state, who defines that. Obviously, depending upon your perspective, that can vary. There's no centralized, in the instance of a well-regulated militia. What does that look like within the context of the Second Amendment? Depending upon who you talk to in the United States, you'll get wildly different answers. It's even difficult to come up with some statistics that aren't bent significantly in one direction or other by the left or the right on this particular issue. The reality is the United States is currently going through a period of time where there are more mass shootings in a year than there are days in that year. There's a problem. Clearly, there's a problem. It is unlike any other country in the world. And the ones you would dare compare the United States to try to get close to that experience, are not ones you'd envy wanting to be compared to. So the reality is there's an enormous gun violence problem in the United States. You talk to folks on the right, typically they'll say the problem isn't guns, the problem is the violent mentality, psychopaths and mental health. And on the other side of the aisle, they won't necessarily disagree with that, but they'll say, sure, there's a lot of crazy, mentally unstable, probably is the better word, individuals out there who have easy access to guns. And we should be regulating that so they don't have easy access to guns. And the right says, well, no, the minute you start regulating guns for the sake of a few crazy individuals, you limit the rights of the broader, responsible gun owners in the United States. It just keeps going back and forth. One of the things, and I've heard this talked about, but not as often or frequently as maybe it should be talked about. Let's say tomorrow you had a Democrat-dominated House and Senate. Let's say they had a majority and a Democratic president who wouldn't veto things. Universal background checks, long waiting periods, etc. Banning of certain types of weapons, or at least restricting them, requiring ownership in the United States. Given the nature, the mentality of those who have defended it and defend almost open and free access to weapons, how do you propose that those weapons are managed effectively? I mean, I think some are suggesting we were going to, putting in place restrictions that wouldn't affect current gun ownership. But I mean, how long is it going to take when you think about the vast number of guns that exist in the United States currently? I think it is important to look forward and to suggest that licensing and waiting periods and background checks federally would make a big difference in gun violence, especially giving mentally unstable individuals easy access to weapons. At least there's a waiting period. At least there's a cooling down period federally. But you're not doing anything about that pool of 400 million weapons. Now, are you going to go out and get them? Logistically, how are you going to do that? And I can hear people practically yelling at me on the other side of the aisle, on the gun reform side of the aisle, whom I generally agree with. I can hear them screaming, it doesn't matter. It does not matter. We will use the military, we will use police forces, and we will go out and by force, we will ensure these new regulations are implemented. Well, all you're doing in that instance is giving a significant part of the gun-owning population who happens to be incredibly paranoid and Second Amendment oriented, or originalists, or whatever you want to call them, an excuse to use those weapons and rise up and create yet another civil war. And if you think that's ridiculous, if you think that's out of the realm of possibility, look at everything that's been going on around the world, especially in the United States, in the last 10 to 20 years. Nothing's impossible. Nothing's ridiculous in this ridiculous age that we live in. Everything is possible. This is the specter that Democrats face when they start getting close to being able to make real change. And it's the specter that is lifted up again and again and again by the gun rights lobby and activists on that side of the aisle. So, I can understand why they're in this place, even in the face of 19 children and 2 adults dying in the most recent mass shooting, not to mention the shooter. And it's often not mentioned, but that is another casualty of this. So, I want to talk a little bit about the mentality that allows this to continue to happen, because I think there's a bit of a broad national psychosis that exists as a result of the Second Amendment and the constant divisive kind of dichotomy that exists and has existed for decades now, if not longer, in the United States when it comes to guns and gun ownership and regulation. This psychosis is a paranoia-based mindset that has been fostered, developed, and nurtured throughout a violent history and founded on a constitution which is highly respected in the United States. And it's such that I can't think of an argument that would convince most gun rights advocates that there should be universal restrictions on weaponry in the United States. Now, some will say, no, that's not true. I mean, Beto O'Rourke recently said more than 90% of Americans, even of gun owners, want to see some form of regulation. And I can tend to believe that. A responsible gun owner recognizes the incredible power in the hands of an individual that a gun places and knows that the best gun owner is a trained gun owner who respects the weapon and not some yokel who just happens to be able to walk into Walmart or wherever and pick up an AR-15 or something along those lines in some sort of an assault weapon and can just shoot in semi-automatic or even an automatic state at cans and bottles until they get pissed off at their neighbor one day and wander over and slaughter their family over a land dispute. I mean, if that's the case, then what's stopping the both sides of the aisle from coming to some level of compromise? And I don't doubt the statistics, but again, it's this psychosis, this specter, this mindset that even I think affects Democrats and gun control activists. The specter of, if it actually happens, how will we do it? How will we implement it? What will be the consequences? Will the consequences be worse than leaving things as is? And so it's this paralyzing thing that locks everything up. At the end of the day, I think that The best solution for the United States is obviously universal background checks, a waiting period, training and licensing for all people, no matter who they are, no matter what state they live in, to own a weapon. I also don't think that's going to happen. And that's not me being cynical. That's me looking at the state of things. I wrote in a blog post recently that, and I think I believe this. People often ask, how many more children have to die? I think in the United States, if every single child died of gun violence, it wouldn't change things when it comes to gun ownership. That's how deep I think this psychosis runs. There isn't a limit, because that's not the basis of why they own guns. I mean, the argument is often, well, we just need to get more armed police officers. We just need to arm our teachers. At some point, somebody's going to suggest arming children. And if it hasn't already been suggested, I think it has. I mean, the reality is, the solution for many people when it comes to gun rights and gun rights advocates is simply more weapons. They just think there's not enough out there. That's not a reasonable argument by any stretch of the imagination. The research doesn't bear that out. But, that's the nature of the mindset down there. The reality is, I think like I said, every child in the United States could die by gun violence, and it wouldn't change anything. The only thing that's going to change substantially in any kind of concrete fashion gun ownership in the United States is if everybody were somehow eliminated through gun violence. Then there would be nobody to argue. That's a really cynical perspective. I recognize that. And I hope that perhaps at some point we will see some legislation down there to our, in that nation to the south of us. I think it's in their best interest. But heck, they can't even agree at the state level on these things. And any kind of federal mandate is resisted in the U.S. It isn't even guns that I'm talking about. They're just not a fan of centralized federal authority and the exercise of that authority. So unless every state is on board somehow, which, like the drinking age, and that's entirely different. Every state is 21 years old, and that's because they've tied up roads infrastructure funding from the federal government related to the drinking age. That's why it's maintained at 21 across every state. Guns are a different story. I don't think that would be enough to change things. So, that's my take. How many more? I don't think there is a number. I don't think there is such a thing in that country, because to use the words of many gun rights advocates, we're dealing with we're dealing with mentally ill individuals. We're dealing with a mental illness, and I think nationally they're dealing with a broad psychosis that infects a large number of people in the nation. And obviously, the NRA and the power it has and the funding it provides to certain politicians when it comes to re-election, it has by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as having been funded by the NRA, and of course that Democrat also holds pro-gun positions. So, although that's unusual, it is on both sides of the aisle. It gives you a sense for the challenges they face when it comes to gun ownership. At the end of the day, it's pretty clear, and the research bears this out again and again, whether you believe it or not, that easy access to guns is fueling a lot of the gun violence that we're seeing in the U.S. And that has to change. If they want to see if they want to see something change in terms of gun violence, they have to make a change there. And nothing else is going to have a substantive change in terms of death and related to gun violence and mass shootings. that's simply a reality they're going to have to face. As long as they don't face it, they're going to keep having these shootings and become cold to it and continue to blame things other than guns because they're so passionately afraid of having anything infringe on that right. And it's really unfortunate that Second Amendment was ever made in the first place, because that's really why they're in this place. But who knows? They might be in this place as a result of their culture, and regardless of whether that amendment occurred. Who knows? Anyways, that's the subject for today. Thank you. You've been listening to a broadcast of the Emergency Podcast System. We now return you to your regularly scheduled programming.